With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the wake of the First World War, almost all of the Arab countries fell under the domination of either France or of Great Britain through the Mandate system. This system gave provisional independence to these countries, but still allowed for administrative control from the great powers until these countries were seen as being able to stand truly independently. I'm your host David, and today we're going to discuss the situation in the Arab countries in the aftermath of the Second World War, so that we have a clearer understanding of one of the most volatile regions in the second half of the 20th century. This is the Cold War. The French were in control of Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, considered part of the Maghreb, as well as Syria and Lebanon. The British found themselves controlling Sudan, South Yemen, Oman, and the Gulf states, as well as Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. Egypt, while nominally independent, was highly reliant on the British, with thousands of British army troops deployed there. As you might expect, slowly but surely, nationalist forces grew in numbers and confidence and started to demand more self-governance. The Second World War and the resulting weakening of both Great Britain and France only increased hopes and demands for full independence. So, before we start looking at specific situations, it's necessary to recognize that the level of political maturity was different from country to country. In some areas where tribal loyalties were paramount, or where the peasantry remained apolitical, the idea of self-conscious nationhood had little reality. In the Arab world, the line was often far from clear between loyalty to an individual nation, such as Egypt or Iraq, when compared to the wider loyalty to a pan-Arab idea. And then, of course, you need to include a rapidly increasing Jewish population and the emergence of the State of Israel following the Second World War, which added another dimension to the political struggle of the Arab countries. So, we're going to start by talking about the positions of the two superpowers, as well as the two great powers who effectively controlled the Arab countries that we're going to talk about. After that, we'll talk more about the specific countries themselves. Great Britain understood that it would be difficult to maintain its empire as it was before the Second World War. Prime Minister Clement Attlee talked about Britain having no desire to retain unwilling peoples, while the Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin, stated that Britain wished to leave behind forever the idea of one country dominating the other. The British plan was to sign agreements with each of the Arab states and accept them as independent states, while still arranging to maintain some low level of dependence from each of the states upon Great Britain. However, the increase of nationalism and the low level of trust that stemmed from the ongoing colonial process prevented these plans from being realized. For example, by late 1945, Egypt and Britain had begun to renegotiate the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement, which had stipulated that the British military was restricted to 10,000 troops in Egypt for the defense of the Suez Canal, and maintain joint governance of Sudan, but with the real power resting with the British. In the renegotiation, Britain would only offer minor concessions, insisting on its continued military control of the Suez Canal, as well as refusing to rule out the possibility of the recognition of an independent Sudan. Rioting against the new agreement broke out across Egypt, and Britain was forced to withdraw its troop presence from the majority of Egypt back into the Suez Canal area. A similar process occurred in Iraq, where Britain tried to reach an agreement with the Iraqi government on a new treaty in late 1947, which would have allowed the British to maintain control over the military base at Habanlia and Shuqaiba, as well as granted access to other Iraqi facilities in the event of war. By January 1948, rioting in Baghdad against the negotiations was sufficient to cause the Iraqi government to break off the proposed treaty. France, despite having been devastated by the war, or perhaps because of it, was very keen on continuing its control of its Arab colonies. In Syria, it vehemently opposed attempts at independence for the country, and in May of 1945, anti-French demonstrations in Damascus and Aleppo were met with bombs and machine guns, and serious fighting also erupted in Homs and Hama. This was the third time in 20 years the French had responded to Syrian independence protests in this manner. It was only under threat of British intervention, proposed by Winston Churchill, that General Charles de Gaulle ordered a ceasefire. A UN resolution in February of 1946 called on France to vacate Syria, to which they acceded, and on April 15, 1946, all French troops were clear of Syrian soil. French reluctance to lose its colonies in the Maghreb in Northwest Africa was even more intransigent, with Tunisia not gaining independence until 1956 and Algeria taking it until 1962 after a brutal war of independence, costing the lives of over 150,000 people. We here at the Cold War channel will be covering this in more detail, so make sure to stay tuned. So that was the position of the regional powers, but where did the two superpowers stand on all of this? The Soviet Union, for its part, was keen to increase its influence in the region, while simultaneously decreasing the power and influence of the Western powers. The Soviets held an advantage as Arab nationalism was largely aimed at British and French imperialism, as they'd not been personally faced by any threat from the Soviet Union. Soviet attempts at direct control in the region began as early as the 1945 Potsdam Conference, where they proposed the USSR have a special trusteeship over Tripolitania in Libya. As you might have already guessed, this was firmly rejected. However, for the most part, the main tactics of the Soviet Union consisted of propaganda, penetration, and diplomatic maneuvering. In effect, they did everything they could to make life more difficult for the British and the French. However, the Soviet Union did opt to support the creation of Israel and the recognition of the right of the Jewish population to its own state. This, as you can well imagine, alienated the Arab countries against Soviet influence. When war broke out in May of 1948, Pravda argued that, quote, with all its sympathy for the national liberation of the Arab peoples, the Soviet public cannot but condemn the aggression of the Arab states against the right of the Jewish people to create their own state in accordance with the decision of the UN General Assembly, end quote. The United States, for its part, had assumed a preeminent role in global affairs in the wake of the Second World War, and this of course included the Middle East. It declared its unequivocal support for the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine, and with the British increasingly unable to exert its own influence in the region, leaned on the Americans heavily for support. As evidence of this, within a short time, the size of the US Navy in the Mediterranean outstripped that of the Royal Navy. Okay, so that gives an idea of the interests and strategies of the great powers in the Arab countries. So now we should look at those countries themselves. We'll start with Egypt, a kingdom that had long been under the significant influence of Great Britain. Led by King Farouk, Egypt was becoming more and more difficult for the British to influence as anti-British sentiments grew. Tensions grew even further as London refused to recognize Sudan as a part of Egypt, over which they had long held a claim. Egypt's support of the Arab cause in Palestine, followed by Israel's victory during the First Arab-Israeli War, further contributed to this disillusionment and political instability. This instability was characterized by assassination, which included the Prime Minister Mahmoud el-Naqrashi Pasha by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was followed by the assassination of Hassan al-Banna, himself the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. Elections held in 1950 were won by the nationalist Wafd Party, largely due to the boycotting of the elections by the Muslim Brotherhood, and the instability issues continued to plague the country. By 1952, the nationalist Free Officers movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, had overthrown the monarchy and established military supremacy over the government. This set the stage for almost uninterrupted dictatorship in the country. Iraq, for its part, was a monarchy ruled by Faisal II, a member of the Hashemite family, and the government was led by the pro-Western Nouri al-Said. As I'd mentioned earlier in this episode, al-Said had agreed with the British in 1948 to allow them access and influence over military installations in Iraq, which would also have lent a great deal of influence to the British over the Iraqi military and its overall foreign policy. The so-called Portsmouth Agreement was highly unpopular, and as a result of much domestic unrest, the treaty was cancelled. Political instability combined with government's continued pro-Western policies eventually led to a military dictatorship in 1958. Led by a nationalist group known as the Free Officers, a new military government was established under Abd al-Karim Qasim. Jordan, in the post-war period, was ruled by the Hashemites, like Iraq, and was given full independence from Britain in 1946. Unlike in Iraq, however, Jordan accepted British military use of bases in Jordan and continued the support of the British-financed Arab Legion, the Jordanian Army, under the London Treaty. Jordan participated in the First Arab-Israeli War as a part of the Arab Coalition and was able to expel Jewish forces from East Jerusalem as well as take control of the West Bank. It's important to note here that the war created an estimated 500,000 Palestinian refugees living in Jordan. The Palestinian refugee issue will become a central theme in Middle Eastern politics as the Cold War progresses. East Jerusalem and the West Bank were formally annexed by Jordan in 1949, a move that was tolerated by the British and the Israelis, but was vehemently opposed by the rest of the Arab world. This left King Abdullah isolated, and in 1951 he was assassinated by Mustafa Shukri Ashu, a Palestinian. Abdullah was succeeded by Talal bin Abdullah, who ushered in a new constitution for Jordan in 1952 before being forced to abdicate as a result of mental health issues. He was succeeded by King Hussein, who retained the monarchy until his death in 1999. Syria, part of the French Mandate after World War I, had proclaimed its independence as early as 1941, but France looked to regain control over the country in the post-war period. As we discussed earlier, the French used force of arms to try and reassert itself in Syria. However, as a result of international pressure from both the British as well as the United Nations, French forces withdrew. Syria was a more democratic state in nature than the other Arab nations, but was still troubled by political instability. By 1949, Syria's democratic government had been overthrown in a military coup, likely backed by the CIA. This initiated a period of extended instability with political control switching back and forth between civilian and military forces. Between 1946 and 1956, Syria had 20 different cabinets and drafted 4 separate constitutions. Lebanon, ethnically and religiously diverse, united in opposition to French repressions. This unified opposition, together with pressure from the British and Americans, forced the French to release all political prisoners in Lebanon, ending the French Mandate on the 22nd of November, 1943, which incidentally is still celebrated as Lebanon's Independence Day. Leaders of the various communities created and signed the National Pact, stipulating the following: that Lebanon would always remain independent, Christian communities would cease to identify themselves with the West, and Arab communities would not seek to merge with any Arab country. Also, Lebanon would continue to maintain its spiritual and intellectual ties to the West, while at the same time would still closely cooperate with other Arab states, but without taking sides in the event of conflict. Finally, top government posts would be divided among the leaders of the various communities. The President of the Republic would be a Maronite Christian, the Prime Minister would be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies would be a Shia Muslim. Although Lebanon was more economically and politically developed than most Arab countries, it did not take long for internal divisions in the country to begin to deepen and entrench themselves. In the Maghreb, France was the longtime colonial master in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, while Libya had been under Italian colonial rule until the Second World War. The French, for their part, like in Syria and Lebanon, were reluctant to give their colonies independence and practiced a policy of both repression and half measures intended to keep them inside the empire. In Algeria, the police arrested Algeria's nationalist leader, Missali Hadj, as well as raiding suspected centers of dissident activity. These repressions resulted in the official deaths of 1,500 Algerians, although there are some estimates that place the death toll at closer to 45,000. France, trying to alleviate the situation somewhat, attempted to establish a two-chamber assembly in Algeria with the upper chamber representing Europeans and so-called meritorious Muslims living in Algeria, while the lower chamber would represent the rest of the Muslim population. This proposed solution was rejected by both Muslims and Europeans. The tension in Algeria would continue to escalate throughout the 1950s as the Algerian nationalist movement continued to grow in proportion to France's opposition. A bloody civil war would soon erupt, which we at the Cold War channel plan to bring you in future episodes. The divorce from France by both Morocco and Tunisia was less violent, but was still far from amicable. It took time for France to gradually divest itself from these two colonies, and eventually grant independence. This happened in Morocco in 1955, with Tunisia gaining its freedom a year later in 1956. Libya, a former Italian colony, took a different route to independence. In 1949, the United Nations General Assembly decided that the former colony should become an independent nation by 1952. In December of 1951, King Idris I declared the country to be independent and set the country on a largely pro-Western course. Domestically, he didn't tolerate any type of opposition, and all political parties were prohibited. He remained the leader of Libya until a coup led by Muammar Gaddafi overthrew him in 1969. In general, the Arab countries each went through different paths to achieve their independence. Some faced extreme bloodshed, while others attained nationhood by relatively peaceful means. However, numerous factors, including the Arab-Israeli conflict and the continued geopolitical struggle between the capitalist world and the socialist world, would turn the region into a place of seemingly permanent military conflict and of dictatorships. We'll continue these discussions in future videos, so make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.